Hi, my name is Edna Lewis. I'm a librarian at the law school, and we're delighted to welcome you to the Free Speech Movement Cafe's annual Constitution Day event. This is one of the charters of the Free Speech Movement Cafe that we do an event on Constitution in connection with Constitution Day. And in this an election year, we thought there was no better program to do than to talk a little bit about voting rights, one of the rights granted by the Constitution. And we are so fortunate to have a graduate of both the law school and the public policy program here, Jonathan Stein, to talk with us about voting rights. He has such an impressive background in voting rights and in civil rights generally. Let me just give you a little bit of his background. He's currently with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Asian Law Caucus, and previously the ACLU of California. He's worked a lot to increase access to voting rights for historically disenfranchised communities. While he was at Berkeley, he was actually one of the student regents on the University of California's Board of Regents, fighting for access, diversity, and affordability. And at Berkeley Law, he was a member of the Men of Color Alliance and the South Asian Law Student Association. Prior to graduate school, he spent 4 years as a journalist at Mother Jones Magazine, also focusing on voting rights there as well, or civil rights, or whatever Mother Jones does, you can tell us. So he's chair of the board of directors of the nonprofit organization California Common Cause, and a commissioner on the City of Oakland Public Ethics Commission. For tonight's forum, we thought it would be good to do this as a little bit like a Q&A. So Jean Ferguson, who is with the library here and is the chair of our committee, is going to be asking Jonathan some questions that we thought would be of interest in connection with the election and voting rights, and then we will open it up to the public for their comments and questions as well. So thank you, Jonathan. It's great to have you here.
All right, so the mic says stay 10 inches back. Can everybody hear me if I'm, okay, good. I'll try not to lean in and make that squeaky noise. So welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Yeah, hi.
Am I getting picked up on the mic? Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
So Jonathan told me about how he was climbing Mount Everest and almost summited and had this freak accident where he hurt his knee. It's actually not such an interesting story.
It's a really dumb story. And we can skip it. That'd be great.
So we'll just go right into talking a little bit about voting rights. So as mentioned, our committee got together and we talked a little bit about what would we like to know about voting rights, particularly in California, and we brainstormed a bunch of questions that hopefully won't stump Jonathan. So I'm just going to dive right in. One of the questions that we had were, are there particular communities in California that are underrepresented when it comes to elections?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thank you for having me.
Oh,
I appreciate it. I appreciate
yeah.
the invite. And thank you all for turning out tonight. So I think in California, because we don't have a draconian voter ID law and because we don't have really repressive felony disenfranchisement laws, people assume that the state of voting rights in California is decent, if not good. But I would submit to you that in fact we actually have a political participation problem in California that is not simply a question of law, but actually a more complex question. To answer your question, the communities that are underrepresented are the Latino community and the Asian American community and young people, and they're underrepresented in really dramatic ways. So in the 2014 elections, the general election in November, 18% of California's eligible Latinos turned out to vote, and I'm not including folks who are not citizens. So of California's Latinos who are 18 and older and citizens, 18% turned out to vote. 17%. Of California's Asian Americans, it was 18%. For non-Asian Americans and Latinos, it was over twice as high, it was 40%. So we're talking about a dramatic underparticipation for those communities. And what that means is that, take Latinos for example, Latinos are 40% of California, they're about 30% of the citizen voting age population of California, and they're only about 15% of voters. For Asian Americans, it's a similar dynamic. So Asian Americans are about 15% of the state, about 13-14% of the citizen voting age population, and only 7% of voters, which means that politicians can ignore those communities and not pay a price for it on election day because those communities, our communities, aren't stepping up and holding people accountable at the ballot box. And the other group that's dramatically underrepresented, at least the other large group that's dramatically underrepresented, are young voters. So if I were to ask you what you think voter turnout was for eligible voters 18 to 24 in the November elections, the last cycle, so November of 2014, if I were to ask you what turnout was, and I've already sort of suggested it was bad, right? What would a guess be? Somebody yell out a guess for what a bad voter turnout would be. 30%, what did you say? 10%, right, that's close. 8%. In 2014, as a 18 or 19-year-old in California, you were more likely to get arrested than you were to vote. So we have a dramatic problem among young voters in the state.
So why do you think that is? You know, like with young voters, I think I kind of understand there's maybe just not an awareness that that their vote really counts. But you know, what about the Latino or the Asian Americans?
So I think the factors are different for the different communities. I think for Latinos, there are certain communities within the Latino community in California, particularly in the Central Valley, for example, where there are socioeconomic characteristics that correlate with low participation across demographics and across states. Low income levels, low educational attainment, and so on. If you're thinking about communities working in agriculture in the Central Valley and so on, that's sort of what's going on there. I think you layer on top of that the fact that both the Latino community and the Asian American community have lived an immigrant experience where you don't have that sort of Norman Rockwell experience where you went to the voting booth with your parents on election day as a 6-year-old holding their finger and you got to pull the lever on the voting machine, right? So you don't have this sort of multi-generational voting experience, right? I think also in the Latino community, you've got fears of government in mixed race households and in the community at large because of the integration of the deportation machine and the criminal justice system, right? So people have, I think, very legitimate fears of government in the Latino community. In the Asian American community, you have a different dynamic where Asian Americans are much more likely than other demographics to identify as no party preference. So about 38% of Asian Americans in California are Democrats, about 38% are no party preference, and about 22% are Republicans. And that's a really high no party preference rate. And parties and candidates, right, are constantly making a cost-benefit analysis. When they're deciding who they're going to send their materials to, they're going to send their mail to, they're going to send canvassers to go meet, they're trying to decide which voters are likely to vote for me, where are my high-propensity voters and my high-propensity Democrats, if I'm a Democrat, or Republicans, if I'm a Republican. And so I think campaigns and parties and candidates look at Asian Americans and they say, we can't figure you out. We don't have an understanding of when you vote and why you vote and who you vote for. And so there's just no outreach done. And in fact, Asian American households in California report receiving less by way of political information than any other demographic.
Wow.
So I think that's also at play. And then the last thing, and I know I've answered, this is a long answer to your question, but I think that the other thing is language. So I think that, the state of California has a steeper challenge when it comes to language access and voting than any other state in the nation.
Sure.
Because we have larger immigrant populations. We have a larger population of folks who are limited English proficient. So among California's Latinos, 75% speak Spanish at home, and I believe 36% are limited English proficient, which means they speak English less than very well according to census data. And among Asian American immigrants, it's 91% speak a language other than English at home, and then I have the data in front of me. 46% are limited English proficient, right? So in well-educated bubbles like Berkeley, we aren't aware necessarily that there are huge swaths of the California population that have difficult accessing an English ballot.
Yeah.
And the availability of in-language materials is uneven and is one of the remaining voting rights challenges the state continues to face. And we'll talk about more about that later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, just go off script a little bit. So
Yeah.
how does that happen? How does a county or a jurisdiction choose whether or not to have other language ballots?
Well, so they don't choose,
They don't choose,
thankfully,
okay, yeah.
because there's a lot of counties that wouldn't choose to provide any translated materials if they had the choice. So the Federal Voting Rights Act, which is, in my opinion, one of the single most one of the most effective pieces of legislation Congress ever passed, was passed in 1965, and it was amended in its second reauthorization in 1975 by a trailblazing woman, a congresswoman named Barbara Jordan from Texas, who was African American, a legendary civil rights leader, and passed away before her time. And she fought to expand the Voting Rights Act to include language protections for limited English proficient voters, specifically Latinos, Asian Americans, and some other groups. And so that mandates, under certain formulas, that counties and other voting jurisdictions provide translated materials when populations hit certain sizes, right?
Sure.
But compliance with that is, as I said, uneven. So since 2000, the Federal Department of Justice has sued Alameda County, San Bernardino County, Napa County, San Benito County, and San Diego County.
Wow.
And it has, all of whom just immediately folded upon getting sued and entered into settlement agreements with the Department of Justice. And in addition, I believe the Department of Justice has sued something like 4 or 5 cities for insufficient language assistance in the administration of city elections. So that's why I said, in many respects, the voting rights challenges that are in the headlines are voter ID laws and voter purges and felony disenfranchisement laws that are happening in North Carolina and in Texas and in Ohio and in California. Because of our demographics, because of the diversity of our state, we just have a different set of voting rights challenges, but ones that are no less intense.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned voter ID laws,
Yeah.
and I moved here a few years ago from North Carolina, where that was big news.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about, what exactly are voter ID laws?
Yeah. So a voter ID law, most people, I'm assuming, have heard about a voter ID law. If you've heard about one voting rights issue, you've probably heard about voter ID laws. The idea behind a voter ID law is that from the perspective of advocates for these things, if you're going to vote, you're taking part in a sacred institution, and you should be required to prove your identity before doing it. And the idea, at least, is that these laws prevent people from rigging the system, that they prevent people from committing voter fraud. So the problem with this is that about 10%, 11, 12% of the population doesn't have ID. Either people who are low income and can't afford a car, or people who are too young and from low income communities. So at 18, when they're ready to vote, they don't own a car, they've never owned a car, they don't drive, they have no need for a driver's license. Or folks who are elderly and have lost the ability to vote. It's really diverse low income communities are the folks who don't have IDs. And it really is an issue where you either are from a community where lots of people don't have ID, and it's a regular part of life, or you're from a community where every person you've ever met has an ID, and you can't understand the idea of living without one.
Right.
And like people will say things like, well, if you need an ID to get on a plane, like why don't you need an ID to vote? And it's like, well, lots of people have never been on planes, you idiot. Like, there's like, you can't just make assumptions about how people live their lives based on your very tiny sliver of experience.
Yeah.
And that fact makes it very hard to, or makes it very easy to sell these things politically, because advocates for voter ID laws, who are almost always Republicans, are always Republicans, will say, well, this protects the integrity of our voting systems, and you don't see a downside because you don't know of anybody who doesn't have ID and would be disenfranchised by a law like this.
Yeah.
But in fact, we actually do know that people are disenfranchised. And it's not safeguarding anything. Like, so there was a study of elections from 2000 to the present, of general elections, primary elections, and special elections, a combined 1 billion votes cast.
Comprehensive.
And this was done by a law professor working with the Brennan Center and published in the Washington Post. You can look it up if you want. They found 31 instances of possible voter fraud that might have been stopped by a voter ID law.
Out of a million.
Out of 1 billion votes cast.
Yeah.
And by the way, with those 31, they weren't 31 convictions or definitive cases of voter fraud. The author was trying to be as generous as possible to show how even when you are like, you're really giving full credence to this idea that there's voter fraud happening,
Yeah.
it's ultimately an infinitesimal problem. And that's what they found. 31 cases of potential voter fraud that might have been stopped by voter ID out of 1 billion votes cast. And by contrast, when the Texas voter ID law was put to the courts, it was struck down just this week, actually, in a big ruling by the Fifth Circuit. But a district court judge found that 600,000 Texans did not have the ID they would need in order to cast their vote. So you're disenfranchising, potentially, 600,000 voters in the name of not really stopping a problem that doesn't really exist.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's ultimately just politics. It's just lawmakers of one party know who gets disenfranchised by voter ID laws, and it's just a way of basically saying, if we don't want to compete with our ideas, we're just going to rig the system, and we're going to decide who gets to play the game.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's just politics. And there's actually been, again, super long answer to your question, but there's been like this actually like positive turning of the tide on voter ID in the last couple weeks, where the Texas voter ID law got overturned, the North Carolina voter ID law got overturned, and the North Dakota voter ID law got overturned. The Wisconsin law got upheld. But I think what's going on, and there's still litigation ongoing, these aren't definitively gone, and in some instances courts required them to be amended in certain ways and added nuance and mandated voter outreach and education, or mandated that voters be able to cast a ballot if they don't have ID, if they complete other requirements. But the point is really that voter ID laws were struck down, and sort of the heart of them were struck down.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is because we have a 4-4 Supreme Court. And circuit judges don't want to be overturned by the Supreme Court. And when you have a conservative Supreme Court that you know is going to be supportive of voter ID laws, and you're a circuit court judge and you're kind of like, well, I know this is all bullshit. Like, I know it's really just a political ploy to disenfranchise people, but there are some semi-credible claims that these other people are making, at least they sound credible. And the Supreme Court has ruled that voter ID laws are illegal in the past. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be the circuit court judge that goes on a limb and then gets myself overturned at the Supreme Court. And now that we have a 4-4 Supreme Court, nobody really knows what's going to happen. The court is deadlocked on what cases it takes, and even when it takes cases, it's deadlocked on its decisions. I think circuit court judges are more willing to get out there a little bit and to strike stuff down. So like when the Fifth Circuit, which is a conservative circuit, struck down the Texas law, it was stunning. I mean, it was an incredible decision from the perspective of people who want to see more people participating in our election system. So that's voter ID in a nutshell, in a big nutshell.
Thank you very much. I'll give you a chance to take a drink. So another topic that we were interested in was non-citizen voting.
Yeah.
And we were kind of looking at constitutional amendments and does the Constitution allow non-citizen voting, which as far as we could tell it does not. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any kind of movements around non-citizen voting.
So non-citizen voting is probably unfamiliar to most folks. Non-citizen voting is the idea that we shouldn't restrict the franchise to citizens of the United States. And that might sound radical to people at first blush, but in fact, over the course of American history, there have been many, many periods where non-citizens were allowed to vote in all sorts of different contexts, in city elections and state elections. In fact, if you go back a couple hundred years, there was a certain amount of non-citizen voting that was semi-common in localities, but never totally widespread. But it is certainly sort of filtered out of the sort of American consciousness at this point. Yeah. There is a ballot proposition in San Francisco in November that will allow parents of children to vote, who are non-citizens, to vote in school elections. Oh. And in fact, that mirrors things that are sometimes done in other places. So non-citizen voting is permitted in a handful of really small Maryland cities. And it's allowed in school elections in Chicago at the super local level. And they were allowed, non-citizen voting was allowed in New York City elections, school elections for a period of time. Schools are sort of the way in for a lot of, on this issue in a lot of ways. And in California, it's pretty dubious, like whether it conforms with the Constitution, the state Constitution, though it's something of an open question. And it really definitively conflicts with the state elections code. The state elections code makes very clear that only citizens can vote. But charter cities, this is probably too deep in the weeds, but in a overall presentation that's completely in the weeds already, but charter cities are certain large California cities that have powers that in some instances supersede state law, or allow them to do things that, state law might otherwise ban. And so it looks as though the charter powers of the city of San Francisco would allow it to overrule the state elections code. So this will be adjudicated sort of probably in the courts if anyone challenges it.
I want to know now more about charter cities. What's a charter
Oh,
city?
so a
Never
charter
heard of
city,
cities,
so a
charter
charter,
city.
so about I think like 70 to 80% of California cities are called general law cities, which means that they are effectively subdivisions of state government, and they are subject to the control of the state legislature in certain ways and must comply with the state law. Charter cities are cities that have taken the trouble. This is all you have to do, I think, is writing their own charter, which is like a city constitution.
Okay.
And if you do that, then you carve out for yourself powers over municipal affairs. And so if there's an issue of statewide concern, then the state law still controls. But if it's an issue, if it's a municipal affair and there is no statewide concern, then you get to do what you want, even if it's in conflict with the state law.
Yeah.
So that may happen with this non-citizen voting thing if it passes in San Francisco. There are some really tricky questions around that.
Yeah.
And even as someone who, I mean, my work every day is working to ensure that immigrant and limited English proficient voters are able to cast a ballot without barriers, and enfranchising communities that have historically been disenfranchised. Like, that's all I do every day. But I'm still a little bit hesitant on the non-citizen voting question for a couple reasons. One is, if you allow people who are not citizens to vote in school elections, they're still not permitted to vote in city, state, and federal elections. And if they vote accidentally in a federal election, that's a federal felony, could have enormous consequences for their immigration status. And if they vote in a state election, that's a state felony, which also could have consequences for immigration status. I mean, to say nothing of criminal prosecution, conceivably.
Right. Yeah.
But let's say you solve that by simply saying we're going to put schools on a separate ballot. So in Maryland, for example, city elections are on a different date than state and federal elections, and so non-citizens voting in city elections don't have any danger of voting in the other ones. You still have to find a way to register people to vote. And the state law lays out a process for voter registration to occur statewide, at the county level and statewide, and it makes it really clear that you have to indicate that you're a citizen in order to register to vote. So if you were to submit a voter registration card and you don't check the box that you're not a citizen, indicating that you're a citizen, your voter registration card is rejected.
Yeah.
And if you go online to use online voter registration, by the way, if anyone's not registered to vote, you can register to vote tonight in like 3 minutes on your phone, because online voter registration in California is really good, and it's registertovote.ca.gov, just a quick pitch. But if you try to submit an online voter registration and you don't indicate that you're a citizen, it's rejected. You can't even move through the process. So the city of San Francisco is going to have to basically develop its own process for registering non-citizens to vote, which then becomes a way of cordoning off all the information of all the non-citizens, including undocumented citizens in the city of San Francisco. And as far as I can tell, it's public information. Like, when you register to vote, your name, your phone number, your address, it's all public information. It can be accessed by parties, it can be accessed by candidates, it can be accessed by the public. When you go to vote on election day, if you go to the polls and you're not a vote by mail voter, look at the front of your polling place. There's a roster of all the voters that vote at that polling place with their names and their addresses and their phone numbers. There's a lot of information about voters that's public. And so if we're encouraging people who are not citizens, who are undocumented, to register to vote using this process, all of a sudden, I don't know that we can control people's information from getting in the hands of immigration authorities, law enforcement, and members of the public who want to create trouble. So there's a lot of work that will have to be done if that passes. There's a lot of work that will have to be done in implementation to make sure people are protected. And my organization will be there, like helping to do the work. So we'll continue to be part of it.
All right, so the whole theme of our evening really is about the Constitution, and about voting rights in the Constitution. So how have constitutional amendments changed over time to either increase or decrease voting rights?
Right. So I expected this question, and so let's play a little bit of a game to walk through the long march of voting rights in this country, okay? To illustrate just how incremental the progress has been over the history of this country and how things continue to this day, all right? So at the first election, George Washington's first election, nobody needs to raise their hands. Who could vote? White men. White male property owners. There's one more qualification. U.S.-born white male property owners.
At the first election.
At the first election. In the first election in this nation's history, 6% of the American population could cast a ballot.
Yeah.
Okay? So really, I mean, like, throwing into question this idea that we were a representative democracy at the beginning, right? I mean, like 6% of the American population could vote. So in 1790, the vote was expanded to include a new group. Does anyone want to guess what it is? Non-landers. So non-landers was like a state by state. That's a really good guess. It was like a state by state sort of thing. So there's no definitive date where like non-landowners got the vote nationwide. A different group. I'll give you a hint. This will probably give it away. Involved immigrants. So now what group do we think? So exactly, white male immigrants. Only men, only white men. Okay, that was in 1790. Let's see here. Okay, so who got the vote next? Anyone want to guess? The natural guess always is African Americans got the vote after the Civil War, right? And in fact, actually after the Mexican-American War, in which America basically took like the western third of the United States, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, granted U.S. citizenship and voting rights to Mexicans living in what was becoming America. But because of English language requirements in voting and because of violence against individuals who try to exercise their right to vote and other sort of suppressive tactics, the experience of Mexican Americans, people who had just become Mexican Americans essentially,
The first ones.
right? The people who did cross the border crossed them. That's who we're talking about. They weren't able to cast their ballot in the same way that African Americans weren't in the Jim Crow South. So we sort of have that history in an earlier way than we're usually accustomed to. So next was African Americans, the passage of the 15th Amendment. Anyone know what year that was? Civil War ended in 1865. 1870. Yeah, nice work. So just think about this. The nation was founded in 1776. Almost 100 years later, right, in 1870, African Americans got the right to vote. And almost 100 years after that, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act made that right accessible to people, right? It almost took 200 years for the rights of people of color, and particularly African American communities, to actually be a free and fair vote. So if you think about the Voting Rights Act as sort of a landmark achievement for this country, the culmination in many ways of the civil rights movement, and the point at which people of color finally had the opportunity to cast a free and fair vote, people of color have had the right to vote in this country, effectively, for 51 out of our 238 years. Right? It is a tiny minority of this country's history. After the 15th Amendment in 1870, who's next? Women, right? Passage of the 19th Amendment after the suffragette movement, right? Captures America's attention. That was in 1920. So now the timeline on American voting rights usually jumps from the suffragette movement to the Voting Rights Act. There's actually a group in between. Does anyone know who we're forgetting? Yeah, Asian Americans. So one answer to this question is Native Americans, and they're sort of not on the timeline because Native American voting rights is this incredibly complicated history, and Native Americans were granted the right to vote if they agreed to assimilate in certain ways, and they were granted the right to vote if they agreed to serve in the US military, and there's all these different histories there that are too complicated to put in a timeline. But the next group to get the right to vote were Asian immigrants. So this is sort of hard to believe, but in 1943, with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants living in America were given the right to become American citizens for the very first time. Wow. They were also allowed to come back into the country. So this Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration. And the repeal of that act in 1943 allowed Chinese immigrants to resume coming to the United States and granted the possibility of citizenship to people who had been here for years or were now coming for the first time. And with citizenship came voting rights, okay? So Chinese Americans were actually, in 1943, the first Asian American immigrant group to get the right to vote. After them came Indian immigrants and Filipino immigrants in 1945. And then Congress gave up this process of giving the right to citizenship and the right to voting on a case-by-case basis in 1952 by just being like, okay, we're gonna stop being dicks about this. Apologies for my language. And allow people who come to this country to become, citizens of the country. And in fact, by the way, the 1952 law that allowed that to happen, in the same breath that it granted the possibility of citizenship, it also restricted access to immigration for certain Asian American countries. And it was almost vetoed. In fact, I believe it was vetoed by Harry Truman for being discriminatory, and then his veto was overridden by Congress. So that's not really necessary information, but there you go. So then came the Voting Rights Act, and then, let's see here. Am I forgetting any? Oh, right. So the Voting Rights Act, we talked about the Voting Rights Act a little bit. We can talk more about it and its impact. But the next constitutional amendment came in, anyone know who was the next group to get voting rights? It's sort of the last, well, it's one of the last steps in this story. Anyone else? It was a constitutional amendment. Exactly, yes. In 1970, the idea was if you're old enough to get drafted and go fight and die in Vietnam, you're old enough to vote in this country. And 18-year-olds got the right to vote in 1970.
What was before?
The 21. 21. And the last step in this process, as I mentioned, is in 1975, a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act that created a section of the Voting Rights Act called Section 203, which is language access for non-English speakers, which really brought meaning to the franchise for immigrant communities and the Latino and Asian American communities primarily. So it's been a long, long road, right?
Yeah.
And it came in sort of fits and starts. And there's more nuance to that history than most people realize, I think.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned about the 1975, the language access protections, in the last 15 years, there's been like, the Federal Department of Justice has sued like 6 counties and 6 cities in the state of California. So the fight for voting rights, the fight for access to the ballot continues to this day.
Well, since you mentioned the Voting Rights Act and we've talked a little bit about it, why don't you tell us more about like the Voting Rights Act and what's changed? Yeah,
so the Voting Rights Act is probably, in my opinion at least, one of the most effective pieces of legislation this country has ever seen. The Voting Rights Act banned election systems that have the impact of of racial discrimination. It doesn't have to be, there is no intent requirement, which is the case in a lot of other areas of the law in order to show, so for example.
Yeah, what's intent requirement?
So for example, there was a famous case, from the South, I believe it's called Williams, that basically it was a case of a black man who was on death row, and his attorneys in their appeal didn't try to say our client is innocent, though I'm assuming they tried that and exhausted their attempts. But what they said was blacks are more likely than whites to be arrested for the same crimes. They're more likely to be charged than whites for the same crimes. They're more likely to get harsher punishments than whites for the same crimes. They're more likely to be put on death row for the same crimes than whites. And they're more likely to be executed for the same crimes than whites. Every piece of the criminal justice system, and this was probably 40 years ago in the South, and you could argue that the legacy of this continues. I don't think you don't need to argue it. I think the legacy of this continues today. At the time, their argument was every single piece of the criminal justice system, and in particular, capital punishment, is soaked in racial bias. And that seems like an obvious violation of the Equal Protection Clause. African Americans do not have equal protection under the law when your criminal justice system looks like this. And the court said, because we cannot find discriminatory intent on the part of any of the actors, the prosecutors, the cops, the lawmakers, any of the actors, we can't find a smoking gun that says we want to execute black people more often than we execute white people. The system gets to stand, and that man was put to death. So that discriminatory intent requirement exists in lots of areas of the law, and is a major, major impediment to justice in a lot of areas. In the Voting Rights Act, they went a different route. And they basically said any election systems that has the impact of racial discrimination can be struck down under the law, which is a huge deal. It also banned literacy requirements and other devices that were used to discriminate against primarily black voters in the Jim Crow South. And it gave federal authorities the authorization to go into these covered jurisdictions, primarily in the South, and register people to vote and oversee elections. So African American voter registration in the South prior to the Voting Rights Act was about a third, less than 30%. And in some counties, it was like 1 or 2%. It really was dependent on the conditions on the ground. In Mississippi, white voter registration was 70% and black voter registration was 7%. And within 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, African American voter registration was over 50% across the South. And from 1965 to 1985 to 1985, the number of African Americans elected to state legislators in the South went from 3 people to like 175 people.
Wow.
And so it was really the beginning of, in my view, full citizenship for communities of color in this country. And you've probably heard that the Voting Rights Act, if you've paid attention to the news at all, you've probably heard that the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in a holding called Shelby County v. Alabama. Shelby County is in Alabama. Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, what was struck down in Shelby County were sections 4 and 5, which were called preclearance. Have people heard the term preclearance before at all? So what preclearance required was it identified the states and counties around the country, mostly in the South, but not entirely in the South, that had the worst history of racial discrimination in voting. And it said, from now on, any change you make to your voting laws, you have to pre-clear with the Federal Department of Justice. They will inspect it to see if it is racially discriminatory in intent or impact. And if it is, we're going to block you from passing it, or we will force you to amend it. Okay? And the Supreme Court ruled in 2013. So the Voting Rights Act, and preclearance in particular, was created in 1965, and then the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, I believe, 5 times. The last of which was in 2006 by huge bipartisan majorities in the Congress with a huge evidentiary record proving its validity and necessity, whatever, and signed by George Bush. But the preclearance formula never changed. So it was the same set of states and counties that were originally covered in 1965 that were still covered into the 2000s. And John Roberts wrote the majority opinion striking down preclearance, and here I have my notes there. So what he wrote was, quote, "Our country has changed, and while any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions." And so basically what the court was saying was, because you never changed the preclearance formula to match modern times, we're going to strike down the law, ignoring the fact that Congress had just evaluated the law 7 years earlier, had an enormous evidentiary record speaking to its effectiveness, and had decided to pass it by huge bipartisan margins. So Congress had evaluated the law, determined it was working, and decided to reauthorize it. And in fact, so from 1999 to 2005, more than 250 discriminatory voting changes were stopped or amended by the Federal Department of Justice, proposed by southern states. And in the year before the Shelby County decision, in 2012, 17 state and local laws were stopped from going into effect because they were discriminatory, right? So there was evidence on the ground that the Voting Rights Act was working and still necessary.
Yeah.
And the court basically said, you're not speaking to modern conditions and we're going to strike it down. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had one of my favorite quotes from a dissenting opinion. And she wrote that basically because we were seeing less discrimination, she was discussing the fact that we see less discrimination in voting and thus we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. And what she wrote was, quote, "Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." Right? And that's what it was. And the impact was immediate. So literally within 24 hours of the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County, Texas moved to introduce a voter ID law that had been blocked by the Federal Department of Justice. Right. And within one year of the Shelby County decision, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia all made changes to their voting laws that were forbidden by the Federal Department of Justice prior to the gutting of preclearance in the Shelby County decision.
Do you think that'll ever get re-added, the preclearance? Like, is there
is
the momentum gone too far?
No, there are efforts, valiant efforts in the Congress every year to introduce a new Voting Rights Act or amendments to the Voting Rights Act that would create a new formula that would speak to current conditions, satisfying effectively what Justice Roberts was speaking of. But I think the Supreme Court knew that this was a dysfunctional Congress and that nothing, if it gutted the law and said, Congress, fix it and make it more relevant to modern times, what it was essentially doing was ending the law for good, at least for the time being. And so Congress never even takes a vote on the Voting Rights Act, as far as I'm aware. It never goes anywhere. So this will be the first presidential election that we've had without the benefits of preclearance. And millions of Americans live in states that no longer have protections that were guaranteed by the Voting Rights Act.
Well, I feel like I've talked to
There's a question here.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say I'm going to
Yeah.
open it up to
Go ahead.
Q&A. So perfect. Go ahead. Yeah.
So thank you for that awesome presentation.
Yeah.
So I'm a Bolt alumni of 2010.
Uh-huh.
So I was there when the Woman of Color Collective got organized.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I'm happy to see that there's now a man of color collective.
Yeah, we were basically imitating walk. That's
Oh, okay.
all it was. Yeah.
Awesome. So I decided to do my PhD in this very subject matter.
Uh-huh.
Because I do intersection of race, class, gender, and disability.
Uh-huh.
And so, especially those that are blind, deaf, physically disabled, people don't know this, but in our nation, 1 in 5 people are going to be disabled at some point in their life.
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you've come across statistics on the disenfranchisement of people with disabilities.
Yeah. So I did once, and I don't have them on the top of my head anymore. But there are these. When I was at the ACLU, one of the laws that we worked to enforce was something called the National Voter Registration Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but is sort of the ugly duckling of voting rights laws. People know the Voting Rights Act, but most people don't know the National Voter Registration Act. It's another name for motor voter. If you've heard of motor voter, it's the reason why you can register to vote at the DMV. That same law requires that agencies administering public benefits programs also offer voter registration to their clients, and offices serving people with disabilities or offer voter registration to their clients, and they do a terrible job of it. And there was, while I was working on that issue, I used to dig in on disability access with partners at Disability Rights California, who I'm sure you know. Yeah. But yeah, it's really, there are systemic problems of access for voters with disabilities. And California has, if I'm not mistaken, the only online voter registration system in the nation that is fully accessible to people with disabilities. Or I take that back. It is the only system that is fully accessible from both a language and a disability perspective. So we're sort of making progress, but it's a problem that is still persists. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, the gentleman way in the back.
Voter ID thing going, because I've voted in every election since 1976.
Yeah.
I've done polls, and no one's ever been asked to bring voter ID or anything like that. You live in this big brother society now where you practically can't do anything without voter ID.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering whether, in spite of these recent court decisions, whether in the future it will have to be launched.
I don't know. It really. We'll see. I think it really ultimately will be decided by a new Supreme Court, and it will, because the one thing that almost the thing that comes closest to guaranteeing the Supreme Court will tackle an issue is a circuit split. So when one circuit court says one thing on an issue and a different circuit says a different thing on the same issue, the Supreme Court has to come in and decide who's right. And there is a circuit split on voter ID right now, and basically different parts of the nation are just making different law in the area in the absence of a Supreme Court that can function. And so I think ultimately in the next couple of years we'll see those laws go to a Supreme Court that has a ninth member, and that will resolve the issue. Voter ID laws. So in addition to not really solving a problem that doesn't really exist. By the way, I should mention that voter fraud there are forms of voter fraud that should concern us. It's vote by mail voter fraud. It's really all it is a family member who, a mom whose daughter is away at college and the vote by mail ballot arrives in the mail, and they don't have time to get it to the daughter who's, in a different state. Before election day, and the mom sort of knows how the daughter wants to vote, and knows the daughter's really excited about voting, and so she fills out the ballot for her. That's vote by mail ballot fraud.
Yeah.
Or there are some instances you can find where somebody passes away, but the vote by mail ballots continue going to the home, and other family members fill it out for the deceased person and stuff. That stuff happens. But in-person voter fraud is such a stupid idea. Like, you are committing a federal felony in order to cast one more vote in an election. Like, what? It's just an incredibly, the cost-benefit ratio is so like heavily against doing it, which is why it doesn't really exist. But anyway, in addition to not really solving a problem that doesn't really exist, it also doesn't increase anyone's faith in the electoral process. That's sort of the idea, or one of the ideas behind it is, if we have voter ID requirements, we're going to make our election systems ironclad and people have more faith in our democratic process. But it turns out, in order to pass a voter ID law, you have to gin up everyone's fears about voter fraud to such an extreme level, and you have to use Fox News and every other form of conservative messaging you have to convince people that our elections are under dire threat, that even in states that have voter ID laws, when you poll people who supported the voter ID laws when they were passed don't feel any more comfortable about their elections. So I think there's legitimate grounds for a Supreme Court, probably in a 5-4 decision, to make new law on voter ID and to say that it has the impact of discriminating against poor and minority voters without any real benefit. So at least I guess that's my personal hope. And that's, my best answer as to where it goes.
How many states have voter IDs, Laura?
Oh, I don't know. It's probably about 35, maybe.
Oh, a lot.
Yeah,
Okay.
But the thing is that there's different kinds of voter ID laws, right? So in some, you can use all sorts of different kinds of ID in order to register to vote and to vote. And if you don't have an ID, you can sign an affidavit at the polling place saying I tried and was unable to obtain an ID, or you can get a waiver if you can't afford the fee for getting an ID. There's all sorts of things you can build in to make a voter ID more accessible. And then there are places like Texas where a gun permit counted on election day, but a student ID didn't. And it was just very clearly designed to disenfranchise certain kinds of voters.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been to some presentations that have talked about the need to establish mandatory voting in the U.S. that
Yeah.
other countries have.
Yeah.
That it would, make for a more functioning Congress, whatever. I was just curious what you know about that. If you
Yeah.
can see that coming about here.
Well, so, I think there's a professor at Bolt, Bertrand Ross, who studies these issues, and he's phenomenal. And one of his ideas is that we need to find ways to, this is something he researches, but lots of people talk about, is that if we would get different policy outcomes if we could create an electorate that looks like the United States of America, and that we have an electorate that looks like America from 20 years ago or more, right? And it's older, it's whiter, it's wealthier than the citizenry as a whole and the nation as a whole. And mandatory voting would fix that problem. Mandatory voting would take all the folks who are not participating, who are in some way either actively frozen out of the process, or who, for one reason or another, aren't taking steps to join the electorate, right? It would push them into the electorate. And we might get, if you're familiar with the median voter theorem, we'd get a different set of policy outcomes because we'd have not just these voters, but we'd have these voters, right? The civil libertarian aspect of me is uncomfortable with mandatory voting. I think you should have the right to opt out of our democratic process if you don't believe in it. As much as I disagree with that point of view, and as much as I wish those people would change their minds, if you fundamentally don't believe that our democracy works or serves you or serves your community, and I think there's a lot of people who have valid claims for feeling that way, I do think you should have the right to not participate. Now, a lot of mandatory voting systems, I think this is true in Australia, allow you to vote a blank ballot if you essentially want to submit a protest vote. Yeah. Or you can pay a small fine in Australia if you don't want to vote on election day, or you can submit a blank ballot, or you can write in something. And if you ever want a laugh in the middle of your workday, Google write-in votes in Australia, because a lot of people who don't want to be voting are forced to vote, and they write in the most awesome stuff, and they doodle, and it's just fantastic. But I think just fundamentally, I think I would rather do the hard work of making the pitch to underrepresented communities that our democracy can and should work for them, and convince people that one, it makes a difference if they vote, and two, when they do, their government will serve their needs. I'd rather get us to that place than just force people to vote by law.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
We'll get
I saw you look this direction.
Yeah.
We looked across each other.
Exactly.
We'll get you.
Going back to one
Oh,
of your earlier comments
another
about
time
the criminal justice system and people
Yeah.
probably more highly incarcerated. And so what do you know about in terms of the change or the people petitioning to help those who are coming out get back to being able to vote?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a couple things to say here. The first is that I just want to, if you work in voting rights, there's no area where there's more misinformation and a greater need for voter education than in felony disenfranchisement, the felony disenfranchisement area. People who have been involved in the criminal justice system in big ways and in small ways often assume they've lost the right to vote, and they've lost it for years and years and years, or they've lost it for life. And that's a product of places like Florida, where if you get a felony conviction, you lose your right to vote for life unless you petition a Republican governor who will never give it back to you, right? So people hear these horror stories, and they just assume that that's true for them as well. In California, in fact, if a misdemeanor never affects your right to vote, so if you're serving time in county jail on a misdemeanor conviction, you have the right to vote from jail. If you're on probation after serving time in a county jail, that's a misdemeanor conviction. You have the right to vote. With a felony conviction, it's different. In California, if you're serving time in state prison on a felony conviction, or you're on state parole because of a felony conviction, you've lost your right to vote. But the minute your parole is over, you're eligible to vote again. You just need to re-register. And while that's good, it's not great. There's 2 states in the nation that don't take away your right to vote with a criminal conviction ever. There's about 15 that say if you're serving time in state prison, you lose it, but the day you get out, you're good to vote again. And then there's the bulk of the country, which is like us, which says after you get out of prison and you finish your term of supervision afterwards, then you get your right to vote back. But none of that really matters if people aren't educated about their rights. And people, this is the area where folks just don't know what their rights are. And I think understandably, don't want to be involved with government. Don't understand. Don't want to be involved with the system, right? And so they don't seek out information about their rights. And there's too few groups doing the work to educate folks. The ACLU of California does a reasonable job of it. They have a website called letmevoteca.org that is geared around educating people about the voting rights of the formerly incarcerated. Yeah, it's one of the areas where we've made the least progress, and the most work needs to be done.
You had a question. Yeah.
All over the world, there is a problem in democratic nations, right, with the declining of the number of people that actually go to vote. So, what's the percentage here in the US, and will we do something about it to try to increase again the percentage that actually go to vote?
Yeah. So voter turnout is a really complex puzzle, and lowering barriers to vote. So making voter registration more accessible is one piece of that puzzle. Making sure that language assistance is available when people go to vote is another piece of that puzzle. Making your giant state voter guide that this year is like 300 pages or whatever accessible to regular people is another piece of that puzzle. Making sure that people with disabilities or the formerly incarcerated know what their rights are is another piece of the puzzle. And then there is this question of motivation, right? There's this question of actually convincing people that their vote makes a difference, which is a different piece of the puzzle. And it's hard. It doesn't take lawyers. Like, it's not a question of rights. It's not a question of changing the law. It's a question of selling people on this idea that their vote makes a difference and that their government and the democratic system can serve them. And that takes organizers and movements, and it's not studied by legal scholars. It's studied by like sociologists and political scientists, right? And it's something that I spent a little bit of time on, right? Like, so on Monday night, I was at a day worker center in Santa Cruz, like working with first-time voters and saying, like, here's how you vote, here's how you register to vote, here's how you vote, here's what to do. Like, literally, you will walk through a door, there will be a table in front of you, you will give your name and your address, right? Like that sort of stuff, right? So that has to get done as well. So it takes, I guess it takes some legal advocacy, but mostly it takes community organizing, and it just takes people who are willing to sort of work with community. And I don't have an easy answer for it. And there's a lot of evidence that shows ultimately all that really matters, well, not all that matters, but one of the biggest drivers of what matters is whether the election is competitive and interesting. So states that are swing states turn out in a big way in presidential elections, and states where everyone knows the outcome of the presidential election matters much less. The turnout for presidential elections is way higher than midterm elections, and turnout for midterm elections is higher than for municipal elections. If the scale of what's going on in front of you, what's at stake in your democracy is big and important and contested, people vote. And if what's at stake is smaller or it's not contested, fewer people vote. There are municipal elections where turnout is under 10% all over the state of California, because municipal elections often in smaller cities get held in like springtime of an off year. And it's like, wait, why is there an election in March of 2017 in some city? Like, no one's the only people who will vote are the people who have always voted. And what will end up happening is that the decisions for that city will be made by effectively 5 to 10% of that city, right? So there's all of these things are different pieces of this puzzle. There's no one easy answer. And this is the last thing I'll say, is that in California, we're lucky because in many respects, California has a more robust nonprofit infrastructure and advocacy infrastructure and activist infrastructure than any other state, bar maybe DC and New York. And so there is a really broad coalition of groups in California called the Future of California Elections that is voting rights experts and voter mobilization experts and voter education experts and elections officials and all sorts of different people from different perspectives who come together to work on the different pieces of the puzzle.
Oh my gosh, there was somebody back here that raised their hand before, so I wanted to make sure.
You largely answered my question.
Okay.
I was going to ask about those figures that you cited before, maybe the difference between midterm elections and general elections. That was a question, and motivation is part of it. But to that point, it seems like, at least with young people, there's incredible motivation. So I imagine that number's much higher during the general elections and midterm elections.
Right.
And so you have this captive audience who, Bernie Sanders now and other movements, and then it seems to completely disappear in midterm elections where a lot is effective. So it's not a matter of education or motivation, it seems. It's just like rechanneling that during these other periods. Do you have any thoughts on how that can be done, or are there connection points that can take that energy to other than just
it's really, really hard. And if I had the answers to it, I would be unique in that respect. No one's really figured this question out. I will say that one part of the puzzle for young voters that makes voter turnout among young voters look worse than it actually is that segment, 18 to 24, it's not a static segment, right? So when you go from a general to a general election, presidential election to a midterm election, in that 2-year period, 2 years worth of that cohort is now aged into the older group, and you've added 2 years of people who have never voted before, right? And so they're teenagers who are being exposed to this for the very first time, and as a result, they're not registered to vote. They're probably not going to vote. They don't know how the democratic process works unless they have really engaged parents or whatever. And so you have to re-educate. If you're talking about 18 to 24-year-olds, that's a six-year piece. Every election cycle, you have to re-educate a third of that group on how democracy works, right? And our schools do a terrible job, by the way, of preparing people. So this is actually one thing I would say as an answer to your question, is that a half a year of civics education in high schools in your senior year is just not enough. Like there needs to be civics education in elementary school and in middle school and all throughout high school, and programs that educate people on not just how to vote, but also why it matters and how one person can make a difference in their democracy. I also think that you just sort of, as a young person, you're just not aware of how tax policy can impact your life. You're not aware of how health policy can impact your life. And there are certain life experiences you just have to have before you realize how meaningful government is. And that's something that you're going to have a very hard time ever combating. So, no good answer to that question. Sorry.
I'm going to take that and then you.
So in regards to felony disenfranchisement, we know that it disproportionately affects people of minority, specifically Black Americans, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a court case, I think it's called Hunter versus Watson, or the other way around, where they overturned and they said that Alabama can't disenfranchise people because the original intent of the law was to particularly target blacks.
Uh-huh.
So I'm wondering, have there been other cases in other states to do the same thing?
Not that I'm aware of, and I'm not even aware of that case, which is weird. I should know it. What state was it? Do you know? Do you remember?
Alabama.
Huh, that's weird. No, so not that I'm aware of. It would, you would have to have a smoking gun that basically shows that the lawmakers passing it were actively trying to disenfranchise people of color, which I'm sure is out there in every instance, or in most instances, but they're hard to find, right? I will say, just as an aside, though, that if you read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, she makes a very persuasive case that felony disenfranchisement laws are a direct descendant of the Jim Crow laws, and that it is essentially a way to shape the electorate, and it has always been a way to shape the electorate. And that when states in the South were unable to use legal means to block people from voting, they made a conscious decision to use felony disenfranchisement laws to do the exact same thing. And that they've just spread through the rest of the nation. And in fact, I think something like, I have this in my notes somewhere, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, what is the number? Here it is. 5 million Americans can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws, including 1 in 13 African Americans. So it's a huge problem, and yeah, it disproportionately affects communities of color. And there has been some progress on felony disenfranchisement in a couple places. So in Virginia, the governor just made the decision to reinstate the voting rights of something like 15,000 people with felony convictions. There was another state, Maryland, I think, that overturned their felony disenfranchisement laws. And in California, we had a case that the ACLU brought when I was there that there was, in 2011, this is super wonky, by the way. In 2011, we reformed our criminal justice system in California, in part because it was the right thing to do, but also in part because the state prison system was under a federal court order to reduce overcrowding because it had reached a humanitarian crisis. And so the governor in 2011 passed something called realignment, where we made a decision as a state, really the governor and a couple people in the state legislature made a decision that we would start punishing low-level felonies as if they were misdemeanors. And that would push a lot of people out of the state prison system into county jails and other forms of county supervision. And when we created this in-between category of felony convictions that were treated like misdemeanor convictions, no one ever thought about what the voting rights of the people in that population would be. The legislature never considered it. Now, if it's a felony conviction, you lose your right to vote. If it's a misdemeanor conviction, you don't lose your right to vote. And the previous Secretary of State made the decision, just on her own, basically, that these would be treated as felony convictions and disenfranchised between 50 and 80,000 Californians just with one memo. And the ACLU challenged that law on the grounds that realignment was created to create a different approach to punishment. And so revoking people's voting rights the same way you would with a felony wasn't appropriate. That if we were trying to create alternatives to incarceration, if we were trying to find more humane ways to punish people for low-level offenses, allowing them to keep their voting rights, which data shows correlates with less recidivism and other things, that was sort of the outcome the legislature would have wanted when it created realignment. We also argued at the time that it was essentially an underground regulation, that the Secretary of State can't just disenfranchise 50 to 80,000 people with a memo. There has to be a rulemaking process that goes into that work. And the ACLU won in district court, and then the Secretary of State appealed, and then a new Secretary of State was elected with different and better views on this subject. And decided to revoke the appeal. And so with the revocation of that appeal, all those folks got the right to vote back. So it was a big win on the issue in California. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you gave us a lot of information there.
Yeah.
In regards to particularly tackling felony disenfranchisement through the courts. So
Yeah.
The first suggestion that I guess I made hasn't been tried yet.
I mean, maybe it has, and I'm just not aware of it.
I'm not sure.
I got Googling to do.
But in terms of like reversing the decision that upheld felony disenfranchisement in terms of Justice Rehnquist's decision in that, like the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause states that people can be disenfranchised if they commit a crime, right?
Yeah.
Some type of other crime.
Yeah.
And so in terms of like flipping that interpretation of the clause, has there been any try through the courts to overturn that decision?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure it was tried and somebody lost, right? Because there's no way no one would try over the course of sort of voting rights history. I'm sure someone's thought of it and tried it. And the fact that it's never part of the conversation usually means somebody tried and lost, and there's bad law on the subject that stops anyone from trying again. That is to say, there's a bad court decision that stops people from trying again because they would just get the same result. But I don't know definitively. I don't know, and it's something I need to research.
Okay, last question.
I was going to ask about, on the topic of young voters, student voters. I know when I was a student out of state, I had no idea how to go about voting, if I was supposed to vote at home or vote
Yeah.
at school.
Totally.
So can you speak on that?
Yeah, so when I was at Bolt, I would do a bunch of campaign organizing, and would be one of the people on Sproul who tried to, convince you to take my flyer on your way to lecture or whatever. And I did a bunch of voter turnout work, voter registration work and voter turnout work among student communities. And I remember election day 2012. Yeah. I was on Sproul, like sort of shepherding people to polling places and making sure people voted and giving stickers to people who had already voted so they would convince their friends to do the same and whatnot. And student after student came up to me and said, a couple things. One said, oh, I want to vote. Where do I go vote? And I was like, are you registered? And I'm like, oh no, I haven't done that yet. Where do I do that? And the answer is you do it 2 years from now at the next election because the deadline was 2 weeks ago. So those folks got disenfranchised for lack of education. And then a lot of folks said, I want to vote, but I never got I'm a vote by mail voter, but I never got my ballot. And my answer is always, well, where did it go? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, did it go to your parents' house? Probably, right? Because people register to vote maybe when they get their driver's license, or not when they get the driver's license, but when they're at the DMV or near home, right? Or they register to vote using their parents' address because they want to use a permanent address, and they know at college you move around a lot, right? And so a lot of times people are registered to vote wherever their parents live, parent or parents live, or they're vote by mail voters, which is better, but not if their ballot goes to their parents' house and they don't get it before election day. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in sort of educating young voters because it's a heavy lift sometimes just to get people to register and then to be interested enough to participate. And then when you have to give them details on, like, here's the specific address you should register to vote at, here's how the arrangements you should make to get your vote by mail ballot before election day, here's the deadline by which you have to get your vote by mail ballot in the mail in order to make your vote count. It's just way too much for folks to sort of grapple with, right? And so there's a lot of hurdles that stop people from participating. And I'm actually part of this this coalition of public groups and private groups, so nonprofit advocacy organizations and state officials that have just signed an MOU with the University of California to get the university to offer more and better voter registration opportunities to its students. And we've got the CSU to sign it as well, and we're working on community colleges on a district by district level. And one of the things that we've written into it is that we've written into this memorandum of understanding, MOU, is that there should be that campuses have an obligation before voter registration deadlines and elections to send not just sort of like go vote messages, but real concrete voter education to their students to try to alleviate some of these problems. And to the extent possible, bring polling places onto campus so that students who live near campus can just vote on their way to class or on their way to lunch or whatever the case may be.
All right. Oh, no. More conversation.
I don't understand. Why do you need to register?
No, that's a great question. I get that question all the time. Why do you need to register to vote? And the answer is because they need a way to make sure you don't vote twice. There's a variety of reasons, but really the most fundamental one is they want to make sure you don't vote twice. If you didn't need to register to vote, you could go vote somewhere in South Berkeley, and then you could just go and vote again in North Berkeley, and like they wouldn't have a way of knowing that you voted twice until many days later, and they've already had to certify the election results, or they have to get results out to the public the night of the election or the day after or whatever, right? So here's how you deal with that. If you can create what are called e-poll books, so instead of having when you go vote, if you go vote at the polls in November, you will sign a roster, a big book, right? If you can replace that big book with essentially a tablet that has everybody's name, right, that is networked with all the other tablets in the county and with the elections office, what that means is that once you vote in one polling place, they can tick your name off on the tablet, and if you go to vote in any other place, they'll see your name with the check mark next to it, and they'll know you've already voted. It's called same-day voter registration, and that enables same-day voter registration, which is to say you can show up, you can register to vote the day of the election, and then cast your ballot, and there's no concern about you going someplace else and doing it again the second time. So there are technological advancements that will create things like, so online voter registration was one advancement that has really made a big difference. Automatic voter registration is another thing that can be, that enables progress. And then e-poll books and same-day voter registration is another thing that we're working on. In California, in fact, we passed that law many years back. In California, we do really cool stuff sometimes. And one thing we do in voting rights law is we pass laws before the technology exists, and we just write into the law that this has to happen whenever the technology is created. And so we basically passed same-day voter registration like 6 years ago, and we're just waiting until we have the technology to do this, but it'll be on the books when it happens. And so there's like a whole sort of election modernization thing going on in California, and it's just too detailed to talk about. But I think a lot of the result of that will be new voter technologies that will allow us to do things like register to vote and vote at the same time.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I'm all for that.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask you all to join me in thanking Jonathan for coming here today.